People are saying, well, maybe the president did the impossible. He got the Democrats and Republicans in opposition to his foreign policy. Both sides are skeptical about the deal with Iran's nuclear program.
And it's not just American politicians that feel this way. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is warning that the deal is dangerous. Chris Mitchell has the story from Jerusalem.
Netanyahu has said repeatedly the deal is a dangerous one for the Jewish state.
Israel has many friends and allies, but when they're mistaken, it's my obligation to speak out clearly and openly and say so. It's my solemn responsibility to protect and defend the one and only Jewish state.
Netanyahu says that Israel is not obligated to the deal, and Israeli leaders are emphasizing that all options, including a military one, are on the table. Now, U.S. Secretary of State Kerry must convince his former Senate colleagues this is a good deal.
I believe Congress will recognize that this deal actually has a great deal of benefit in it.
Some remain unconvinced.
Nothing in this deal requires the destruction of any centrifuges. They're going to continue to be able to replace centrifuges that become inoperable. And I just don't see this movement in the direction of preventing Iran from developing a nuclear weapon at all.
Already there's a disagreement over one of the agreement's key provisions, the right to enrich uranium.
There is no right to enrich. We do not recognize a right to enrich. It is clear in the NPT, in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, it's very, very clear that there is no right to enrich.
But Iran's president sees the right to enrich uranium as the keystone to this agreement and says the world powers have recognized Iran's nuclear rights.
No matter what interpretations are given, Iran's right to enrichment has been recognized in the text of the agreement. For that reason, I announced to the Iranian nation that Iran's enrichment activity will continue as before.
This is an interim agreement, but Iran's foreign minister says negotiations for the next phase could begin in just a few weeks.
Well, you know, the thing that amazes me is, why did we do it? The Iranians were on the ropes. The sanctions were really biting, and their economy was hurting badly. Why, when you have your enemy down and you're getting ready to win, why do you let up? Well, we've let up. And it's like Chamberlain. Years ago, it was fixed in my mind. I was just a youngster, but Chamberlain raising his umbrella and claiming that the Munich Accord with Adolf Hitler, and Hitler was laughing at him. He said, what an idiot this Chamberlain is. I took advantage of him, got everything I wanted, and he sold out the Czechs, and the next thing you know, we've got World War II. So this agreement essentially says Iran is now legitimately a nuclear power. That's what they've said. And you ask yourself, what's wrong with Obama? Well, is he looking to turn attention away from this disastrous health care? You don't know. Well, Chris Mitchell is with us now from Jerusalem. And Chris, you have sources in Israel. What are they telling you about this deal?
Well, much the same thing you just said, Pat. One of the things it does, it legitimizes Iran as a nuclear power. There's been 6 United Nations resolutions condemning Iran's use of enriched uranium, and yet this legitimizes it. It also lessens the sanctions when it should be strengthened, and it also puts Iran as a nuclear threshold country. And what that means is that if Iran wants to go to a nuclear breakout stage, it can do so in a matter of months, if not a matter of weeks. And so that's why Netanyahu is calling this not a historic deal, but a historic mistake.
Chris, in your opinion, or the opinion of the people you're talking to, does this make an Israeli strike on Iran more likely?
I think it does, Pat. It also isolates Israel diplomatically. If Israel does make a military strike, like it has said it would, that the military option is still on the table, then that puts itself against the P5+1, these world powers that have struck the deal with Iran. Just last week, we reported that Yaakov Amidror, the former national security advisor to Israel, said that Israel has the capability to strike Iran's nuclear program and significantly reduce its capacity, and that Israeli pilots have been training all over the world. So I really do think this makes a possible military strike by Israel more likely.
What about the secret negotiations? Apparently, without telling anybody, Kerry and others were making negotiations with the Iranians behind the scenes. What do you know about that?
Well, I know, Pat, that was going on since March, and that was actually before Rouhani was elected Iranian's president, when Ahmadinejad was still Iran's president. Israel found out about that at the beginning of the summer, and just 2 months ago was, quote, officially told by Obama. That's when he gave the news to Netanyahu. I think that makes Israel perhaps a little more skeptical about the way that the United States is going about these negotiations with Iran. Apparently, those talks form the basis of the Geneva talks. And as you said, Pat, a lot of people are using the Munich analogy that this does make war more likely because then in 1938, the West appeased Hitler. Now it seems many people are saying that the West has appeased Khomeini. And I think this is the kind of uncharted waters we are in right now in the Middle East.
We've seen public statements about Saudi Arabia. What are you hearing behind the scenes about the Saudis?
Well, there's no evidence right now, Pat, that Israel and Saudi Arabia are working together, but I talked to a security analyst earlier today, and he said he'd be surprised if there's no secret negotiations or communications going on between Israel and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states as well. The Gulf states have been very quiet since this deal was struck, but they did meet over the weekend, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and many of the other Gulf states. So there's a common interest, and it really has made strange bedfellows here in the Middle East with Israel and the Saudi Arabia seeing Iran as a mortal threat to each of their countries.
Well, Chris, you met with Netanyahu last week in Moscow in a private meeting. What did you ask him?
Well, they had a private briefing, Pat, for many of the reporters, and there was only one question that they wanted to actually be published. It's the question I was able to ask. The question was this: given the fact that Iran's nuclear threat and what he said in the United Nations, he quoted from the prophet Amos, that Israel had been rooted in the land and they would never be rooted out again. And I said, do you feel, it's like this is 1938, and do you feel like Churchill? And he answered that he did, and that he feels personally responsible for the continuation of the Jewish state. And he feels this weight upon his shoulders, this weight of Jewish history. And I think because he feels that, he's not afraid to confront the United States. He's not afraid to say to the world that you're missing it with Iran. He's not afraid to stand up against Khomeini, who has asked for the elimination of the Jewish state. So I think he feels this quite responsible. I think he sees the historic analogy between 1938 and 2013. And I think that's why, in many ways, I'm hearing a lot of people are praying like never before for what's happening right now in the Middle East. These are dangerous, uncharted waters, and people need to be praying, just like Paul exhorted Timothy in the 2nd chapter. Pray for the leaders, pray for Netanyahu, Obama, these world leaders, for such a time as this.
Chris, one last question. You've written a book, very interesting book, called Dateline Jerusalem. Is that available now for people, and where do they get it?
They can get it anywhere, Pat. Amazon.com, any of your bookstores or neighborhood bookstores, you'll be able to find it. And what we talk about in that book, Pat, is about Iran. And many people don't realize why Iran wants a nuclear program. They know what's going on, but many times they don't understand what you have reported many times and said, that Iran has an ideology that wants to help return this mythical 12th Imam or the Mahdi. And to do that, they want to foment crisis in the world. And so when you take this messianic ideology and this nuclear technology, it's really a toxic brew with regional and global implications. And so we talk about that in the book, as well as many other things, all these prophetic events that are unfolding in our time, which leads me to say 2,000 years ago, all roads led to Rome. 2,000 years later, all roads are leading back to Jerusalem.
Our reporter in Jerusalem, Chris Mitchell, is called Dateline Jerusalem. It's a very interesting book, and you can get a copy at wherever. Have you read it?
Well, this is the place to keep an eye on in this day.
You know, that's the thing about when Kerry's dealing with the Iranians, he doesn't understand the theology. I'm not going to give up my belief in Jesus just because somebody tries to negotiate me out of it. And those people are not going to give up their belief in the 12th Imam and the Mahdi and in the eschatology that they hold dear. There's no way they're going to give that up. They're not going to surrender their deeply held religious beliefs. And part of that belief is that there's going to be chaos in the world. The Mahdi will make it well. Then I guess Jesus comes back, and along with him, the Prophet Muhammad, and everybody bows down and says, Muhammad, you're the man. That's what they believe. And they're willing to see chaos come to the world in order to bring it about. So, I mean, you're not going to talk them out of that in some kind of negotiation. Well, the deal with Iran could do something good for your pocketbook at the gas pump. And Charlene Israel has that story. Here's Charlene.
That's right, Pat. Oil prices could fall because of the nuclear deal with Iran. The plan does not allow Iran to sell any more oil right now, but it does open the door for a future deal that would eventually allow Iran to increase production. That would put more oil on the world markets and help bring the price down, and that in turn would lead to lower prices at the pump. But analysts say if the deal falls apart, the cost of oil could shoot back up again. Oil and gas prices have already been falling in the last few months. And drivers are running into a powerful winter storm system, dumping heavy rain and snow across a large part of the country. The icy weather is already blamed for at least 8 traffic-related deaths.
It was freezing and we were sliding all over the road, and it was pretty intense.
The dangerous conditions are set to affect travel over the holiday week. Hundreds of flights were canceled at Dallas-Fort Worth as crews scrambled to de-ice planes, and interstates across the country are closed. AAA estimates more than 43 million Americans will travel 50 or more miles from their homes from Wednesday through December 1st. Traveling mercies are definitely needed.
Well, I'm glad it's not me out there in those storms.
Well, you know, it's so cold here today that if we had precipitation, we'd have snow.
Hot Springs, Virginia. It was 1 degree yesterday. 1 degree with wind chill. It was 17 with a 17 wind. 1 degree. That gets cold.
That gets very cold.
Cold.
Let's hope that's not an indication of things to come.
Some years ago, I was in Dallas, Texas. And I got there, it was like 60 degrees. Woke up the next morning, the freeze had come across the plains. And there was a sheet of ice over all the roads, and I had to drive to Fort Worth. I mean, it was worth your life because there was no traction on the road. You had to drive at just a glacial
You just
speed.
need to stay home when it's like that.
Well, in my case,
Not
I was.
you, but
yeah, I know, but I was in a hotel and I had to go to a meeting. But you want to stay home, absolutely. All right.
The city of Portland, Oregon has been ordered to pay $19,000 to a city employee over religious harassment. Kelly Marie Griffin says her co-worker at the Mount Tabor maintenance yard complained when she said, "God bless you," after a sneeze. Griffin says the co-worker also said, quote, "I'm tired of your Christian attitude." The co-worker also mocked her for praying, calling God a figment of her imagination. After 4 years of harassment, Griffin filed suit. A federal jury ruled in her favor, saying her workplace was hostile to her religion. CBN's Orphans Promise is helping gypsy communities in the Ukraine to grow their own potatoes, vegetables, and corn. It's part of an ongoing project called Something to Eat Every Day. In total, 168 large, needy families raising 751 children are participating in the project. More than 55 tons of potatoes and 5 tons of various vegetables and corn were grown and kept for winter. The total harvest was more than 70 tons, and all the participants got food, and many of them donated part of their harvest to others in need. You can find out more about what CBN is doing around the world by logging on to cbn.com/international.